I like the fact that it's cheap. I like the fact that it's well made. This lens is loads of lens. It's for general photography, it works for portraits, and it works for macro. Well, hey everybody, welcome to another episode. Thank you for checking in once again, and thank you for joining me. And today we're going to have a look at this lens. This is a lens that I've bought recently, and it was actually a fairly cheap lens. This is not an expensive lens. It's the Sigma 90mm f2.8 macro. So this is a lens that is a very versatile lens. It's really good for portraits, it's really good for general photography, and it's also really good for macro, or at least 1:2 macro. It doesn't do 1:1, it's a 1:2 macro lens. There was apparently a little attachment you could get to go on the front there that will bring it down to 1:1, but as it stands it's 1:2, or half macro if you like, but it still gets down to a very close distance, and it still will give you you know, a really big image of a really small thing. It can get in very, very close, and if you're interested in photographing tiny little details, as I must say I very often have been, I find that a very interesting kind of photography to do, then this could be a lens for you. As I say, this is not an expensive lens. I bought this, well, I'll tell you what they usually go for. They usually go for around about 90 to 100 pounds on everybody's favorite internet auction site. So that's about £1 per millimeter of focal length. Don't buy, if you're buying vintage lenses, it doesn't pay to buy the first one that you see, because most lenses advertised will be advertised for pretty much a similar price. You have to be patient and wait for the bargains to come along, and you know, eventually, inevitably, they will. And that's what I did with this one. I got this for £35, and I've been having a lot of fun with this lens. f2.8 isn't particularly fast in the final analysis, but when it's paired with a nice long focal length, 90mm, which this one has, that becomes a lens that's going to give you quite a lot of background blur. And you know, if you like the blurry stuff, this one will do it for you. Now, being a vintage lens, it's nicely made. Not all vintage lenses were nicely made, of course, but they do tend to be free of plastics and so on, and this one's no exception. This is an all metal lens, and you can see now now I've got the adapter off. The adapter does add a fair old bit of length, but once we get the adapter off, you can see what a small lens that is. It does extend a little bit, and it extends by about 1 inch, as you can see there. But generally, that's no bigger than a good many 50mm f1.4 lenses. Certainly f1.2 lenses wouldn't be too much bigger than this one. It's not particularly heavy. It does have a nice amount of weight to it. It's not a light lens. And I don't think there's too much plastic used in its construction. The front ring here, I think, is plastic, and there are 1 or 2 plastic bits, but most of it is all metal. It's nicely finished, it's nicely made. I would guess much of it is aluminium, but there's plenty of weight there, so there's got to be quite a bit of brass in there as well. So in the best tradition of vintage lenses, this is a really nicely made all metal lens. A couple of little bits of plastic here and there, but nothing really to speak of. I think the aperture ring is plastic, and like a lot of third-party lenses, it does have that slightly cheap feeling aperture ring when you turn it. There's nothing wrong with it, it works fine, it's got half stops, but it doesn't have the silky buttery aperture ring that some lenses have. But we'll forgive it that, you know, we can give it a pass for that. That's no problem at all. And you can see it's not too big on the camera. It's not a huge contraption. And you know, when you compare it to a lens like, for example, the Helios 40, that's a monstrous thing, and I really wouldn't want to carry a lens like that around all day. But a lens like this you can carry around all day, and it would be it does in fact, not would be, but it does make a great walk around lens because it's so versatile. The first thing that occurred to me when I shot this lens was, gosh, isn't it sharp? And it really is amazingly sharp. For a vintage lens, that is quite something. Most vintage lenses are a bit soft, wide open. Macro lenses do tend to have that little bit of extra sharpness built into them. This one certainly has it. There is no lack of sharpness with this lens. Wide open at f2.8, it's very sharp indeed. If you stop it down a bit to f4, f5.6 or f8, in theory it ought to get sharper, but I'm not sure that it actually does. I can't actually see any improvement. I'm going to assume there is an improvement. I'm going to assume it does get sharper because that's what lenses do when you stop them down, and I don't see why this one should be any exception. But wide open, it's got most of its sharpness already there, and if you're looking for something that will do sharp images, that will make you a sharp image, this must be one of the sharpest vintage lenses I've used. I don't think they come very much sharper than that, so absolutely top marks for sharpness. With a 90mm focal length and a relatively fast aperture of f2.8, this lens does make plenty of blur. The quality of the blur can be really nice. There are distances, certain relations of distance between camera, subject and background when you're using this lens where it just works. It just all comes together and you get this beautiful softness in the background. The blur is soft, smooth, it's delicate, it has a dynamic feel, it looks like it's kind of in motion almost, and at certain distances it's very, very beautiful indeed. There are other distances where it's not so beautiful, and it turns what I might call, I don't know, the word I use for it is a little bit woolly. It looks like wool. It becomes a little bit rough. It looks a bit like it's been knitted. It's got some of the harsh texture of the fabric that wool might have. That's what it feels like. It feels like a rough woolen garment. It feels like balls of wool in the background. It feels like that kind of texture that wool would have, and it's not particularly pleasant. You can shoot around it, but blur I would give this lens, I don't know, 7 out of 10 I think would be fair. Sometimes it's really nice, sometimes it's a bit rough and scratchy. If you're doing a macro shot, stop that aperture down, otherwise your subject isn't going to be in proper focus and you're just going to have a completely blurred out, smoothed out, completely homogeneous background, which doesn't really work in my view. Too much blur doesn't really work, just like too little blur often doesn't work. Too much blur where everything's squidged and smeared out, that doesn't work too well either. So stop it down for macro shots. Contrast from this lens is not particularly strong or high, and it's not particularly low or washed out either. It sits somewhere in the middle. It's got low-ish contrast, but I wouldn't call it a low contrast lens as such. It's slightly towards the low contrast side of things. And actually I rather like that. It gives a nice sort of delicate feel to images, and it's got that lovely low contrast, delicate, gentle sort of look to it that some lenses can make, and that gives a nice vintage sort of feel to images as well. It tends to resist dropping out pretty well in the sunlight. Most vintage lenses, or in fact almost all lenses that I know of, will drop their contrast, will give lower contrast images if you're shooting in the sun and you get a ray just striking the lens at such an angle that the light reverberates within the element. It gets sort of caught within the glass element and sort of reverberates around and splashes around and washes all the contrast out. Well, that can happen with this lens, but it's not the worst vintage lens I've encountered for that. Most are rather worse, in fact. This is one of the better lenses for resisting contrast dropping out, but it will drop out if you do shoot into the sun, and if you're unfortunate enough to catch a ray at the wrong angle, splosh, down your contrast will go. That's not always a bad look, but I guess shoot it with a hood if you want to avoid it, or you can just shield it with your hand if you know where to put your hand. It can be a bit tricky finding the right spot, but you can do it with your hand as well. Right, what else? Colour. Okay. Well, I've written pale and sleepy. Well, that's a bit enigmatic, isn't it? Pale and sleepy colour. What did I mean by that? I've also written cool, and I do know what I mean by that, because this lens is on the cool side. It does give colours that are on the cool side. It's not by any means a warm lens, and it emphasises the bluish end of things rather than the warmer reddish end of the colour spectrum. Pale and sleepy, well, they're not particularly energetic colours. They're rather restrained and laid back. They're a little bit pastel-y, actually. They're quite sort of delicate and damp. They're very resonant. They're very bold as well. Colours certainly come through this lens and make a striking impression in the final image. It's not that this is a lens that can't emphasize colour and can't give you striking colours. It certainly can, but the general palette is quite restrained. So these are not Minolta style colours that, you know, leap right out of the image and, you know, kind of attack you and get hold of you and give you a good shaking. They're not those sorts of colours. They're much more restrained, much more delicate, much more soft, if you like. They give images a bit of a softer feel. This is a gentle, restrained sort of image. This is not an in-your-face, loud, shouty kind of image. And colours add to that impression. Colours are a big part of that. Oh, somebody's been naughty. Colours are a big part of what makes that, gives the lens that feel. Chromatic aberration, I've written, there is some, and that's accurate, there is some. This lens does have, in fact, a fair old bit of chromatic aberration. It's wherever you get an edge, a sharp edge, a sharply focused edge against a patch of bright light, maybe the sky. So wherever you get those conditions arising, very often you get chromatic aberration, and it's purple and you can see it fairly clearly, and sometimes there's quite a lot of it. Now, I know there are photographers who will run a mile at the mere mention of chromatic aberration, but I'm not one of those photographers. I regard it as part of the look of the lens, and I don't let it concern me too much, because honestly I don't think it is that concerning. This lens is loads of lens. It's for general photography, it works for portraits and it works for macro shots. So even if you pay 90, 100 quid, it's still good value, but you can find them cheaper if you're patient and persistent. So I like the fact that it's cheap. I like the fact that it's well made and that it's a good solid piece of metal, aluminium and brass. I like the fact that it's got this nice big focus ring that you can turn and that you can find very easily with your fingers. That's a nice design point. I like the fact that it's small. It's a 90mm, but it's not an enormous thing. It's relatively fast aperture, but again, it's not an enormous thing. So it's great because you can carry it around, unlike something like a Helios 40. And it's versatile as well. There's so much you can do with it. This one lens will do so much. General photography, macro photography, and portraits also. I'm not too keen on the slightly roughish blur, and it does have a fair old bit of chromatic aberration, but I'm going to give it a pass for both those things because of its amazing versatility, because of its amazing sharpness, and because of its nice, delicate, restrained color palette, which I do like very much. Actually, this is a really lovely little lens. I was very surprised to find it. I was even more surprised when I found out how nicely it's shot. So a real bargain all round and quite a find, I think. So I guess that's it from me for now. I do hope you found that episode useful, interesting, enjoyable, or otherwise edifying and useful. Thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate that, and many thanks to everybody who's engaged with the channel in any way, anyone who's commented, given thanks, subscribed or engaged with it in any way. If you've enjoyed this episode, chuck us a sub, that would be appreciated. Many thanks go to subscribers for your support. Thank you very much for your support. Many thanks also go to patrons for your support. Thank you very much for that support also. It really is appreciated. All the support that people give in whatever form it is given. Thank you. So that's it from me for now. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and if you're not doing anything too difficult, troublesome, bothersome or irksome next week at around this time, please do check in and join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.